Showed you the experimental pictures for the 3D bouncing drop with that moving pool. I forgot to show you the DNS. This is the simulation domain. It's got a moving pool, and you can see the droplet bouncing in a preferential direction and the sort of wave field moving. So the domain is actually not quite as large in this one because it's a full 3D one, and I've imposed, rather than fixed walls, it is an inflow-outflow condition, so it's a bit nicer with us in that respect. But yeah, it's it seems to be getting us reasonably robust results, which was interesting to see. So with that quick intro, I'll jump back to the splashing problem I was telling you about. So yeah, we had this really nice framework of matched asymptotic theory through the Wagner framework that we were exploring beforehand. And I mentioned that each of these regions, the outer, the inner, and the jet region, come with their own flavor of interesting mathematics that I've summarized here. And really, if we look at the whole problem put together, this is the type of information on the left-hand side that we get analytically in this problem. So you find coordinates of the jet route, you find the thickness of the jet, you find the velocity along it, and they're all, I remind you that R's and V's are constants, so all of those formulae are actually pretty easy to digest. And if I try to run a computational counterpart thereof, so this is in 2D, and what you see here, I'll just stop it here, is in this case, we leave everything in the DNS. So the DNS does have viscosities, that has surface tension, it has gravity, all the stuff we've discarded to make analytical progress. And because it has surface tension, you'll notice, for example, here we do get a droplet forming at the capillary tip. We do have a bubble entrapped, and it'll collapse onto itself towards the end. You'll get atomization, so this is a droplet being splashed. Honestly, the only place that is well resolved to a really sufficient degree of accuracy is this region where we've looked into the Wagner theory comparison. If you want the actual breakup process and the bubble formation to be accurately resolved, probably a bit more resources were needed there. But I'll show you the comparison to the analytical framework over the next few slides. So what I'll show you will have symbols for the DNS, and it'll have curves for the analytical result. So these are all predictions for the jet route coordinates for various values of the radius ratio and the velocity ratio. And actually, as long as you're kind of within the realms of the theory, by which I mean this is an asymptotic framework for sufficiently early times. What I mean by sufficiently early times? Well, it turns out that if the route of the jet goes beyond a radius of the drop, then you kind of lose the accuracy from the analytical prediction, or at least they deviate sufficiently long from one another. So if I return back to my little movie for a bit, if you were to measure, I'll tell you kind of how I did this. Where's my clicker? Here. You take a look at what the curvature, point of maximum curvature here is, the turnover point for the north side, the same for the south side. You draw a line between them, and you find the intersection with this virtual interface between them, and that is the route of your jet, the point xj and yj I was measuring. When that surpasses the radius of the initial drop, that's roughly when we see that the theory and the simulations start not agreeing quite as much, which is quite remarkable because that's quite a, early times, but not quite as early as we anticipated. And it's the same for information such as, the velocity along the jet, which the theory predicts to be linear. You do have to make adjustments, so to account for the fact that the bubble being present means that the coalescence happens a bit later and the splash jet moves a bit laterally. But with all of these, if you have a systematic way of doing it, you can actually get pretty good agreement. This is the jet thickness, which again, for sufficiently early times works fine. The only thing that seemed a bit unusual was actually the angle at which the jet was shooting out. And in that case, what was happening is, if you look at this line and these sets of symbols, these are all different numerical kind of methods. You can treat this as one line, really. The point is, the value here is about 40 degrees, and the value predicted by the theory was 15 or 20 degrees, which really indicated that there is a mechanism that one has that is not present in the other one that may be important, which we attributed to vorticity at the time, but this seemed to be a point of further investigation. But it was nice to be able to do these comparisons for particular cases, which brings me to my first post-lunch activity time. So if we jump back to the website we had before, I'll jump to the question. Since I've talked a bit about how much some of these tend to kind of take in terms of resources and time. This is a simple question of, not for this one. I do not have the right one. Just give me one sec. This one is the one I wanted. Roughly, how many CPU hours do you think we need in this problem? For the 2D standard problem, and I've given you order of magnitude estimates. So about 1 hour, 10 hours. I like the optimism of the first answer.
You could say for a few days.
Yeah, I think I remember, we were doing them for about 3 days on 8 or 16 CPUs. So you multiplied 3 times 16, say, times 24. That's how many CPU hours you can get roughly out of this. So yeah, it would be again at the bottom. As a tip and trick, most of the answers you'll need are at the bottom side of these panels. I've not designed them in a very subtle way. But yeah, I think for the 2D problem, it takes quite a bit of time, and I'm really just warming you up for the fact that we're going to jump into the 3D version of the problem now. So if this took that much for that, the other thing I should be happy to tell you is for any test problems I've set up for a bit later this afternoon, it's not going to be that. I've set them up as nice problems that you can test out in seconds and so on and so forth. But just to know that production level runs for difficult scenarios like this one, with coalescence, with topological changes, with splashing, with everything, take time and effort to do. In many cases, as you know, journal referees or grant referees, we get quite a few the types of results that raise questions in terms of, reliability, mesh independence, and we do really see that unless you take them to a sufficiently kind of accurate extent, a sufficient resolution level, many of the results are not robust enough to be trustworthy. So in some sense, there's a certain amount of effort that needs to be put in before you can get there, but once you get there, you're in a really happy place because you have access to a lot more data. So the bonus question to this one is, if anyone wants to venture a guess, for a typical run like that one, to be able to extract the root of the jet, the velocity field everywhere in a moving domain and so on, how much do you think a data set is in gigabytes for everything you may need at any point in time? Any guesses? Yeah, it's in the kind of 50 to lower hundreds, depending on how difficult the case is. Gigs, yeah. And, then you have to take into account, so I'll deactivate this and jump back, that in order to do, comparisons of this type, where you have different radii, different velocity ratios, and so on, each of these, we needed external hard drives to store these and run these properly. Not for everything. You can sort of layer your output in a way that you get easily accessible information and backup stuff. But if you want to keep a kind of systematic data stream, you may have to go quite far into it. So yeah, I stopped at this question point as well as to what happens with that jet angle. So this brings me to the 3D version of the problem, which I'll run through pretty quickly because we're all good at this now. It's the same setup, it's the same type of assumptions. The only thing I have extra now is that droplet up top may come in at an angle. So there is now a new ratio, the ratio between u and v, the horizontal incoming velocity and the vertical velocity, which lends the obliqueness of the problem. But otherwise, it's the same set of assumptions that you've seen here. So in some sense, the asymptotic structures is the same. You still see the inner region, the outer region, and the jet region here. And interestingly, you can run it through the same machinery. It gives you a few complications along the way. What I want to highlight really is many of these quantities that we see appear to be independent of this ratio I highlighted, the obliqueness of the velocity. And interestingly, when I presented this in Oxford at some point, John and Hilary Ockenden pointed to us that this seems to be an embodiment of what's called the Linhart paradox. I dug this out, if anyone is interested. There's a really nice book. So this is the actual Linhart paradox, by the way. I'll make it a bit bigger for us. the question here was, why when a high-speed projectile enters a liquid at an angle, is the splash symmetrical without a direction parallel to that of the projectile? So they were doing bullets and actual projectiles. This is a high-speed impact scenario. But they were noticing that the obliqueness seemed to have no effect on the results. And this was, you'll notice the date, this is 1990. If you ever have a cup of tea break and you don't know what to read, I think this is 14 or so pages worth reading. So basically what it does is it lists in some level of detail, I'll jump back to 100%, a set of interesting questions at the time. So if anything, it's like a time capsule. What kind of fascinated the mind of the fluid dynamics community 35 years ago? And many of them remain outstanding issues. Many of them are quite interesting in their own right, like after the one I highlighted for ourselves, this one, you'll notice there's Marangoni flow problems, pool fire vortex shedding, there's one about lightning in clouds, like some really cool stuff. I think it's worth a read just to see kind of what was interesting at the time. But yeah, I think we were a bit mystified as to why this wasn't manifesting itself until kind of the velocity was next order in the approximation. It seemed to have a fairly weak effect. It seems to check out historically, which was interesting to us. The other notable thing is I've put here side by side 2D and 3D results, 3D and 2D results of kind of what we obtained before with the previous framework versus now. And you'll notice that, yes, coefficients change and there are a few adjustments because of the geometry, but otherwise the functional form of these is not dissimilar. So I think once you do the hard work of understanding this platform, you can actually get quite a bit of information out of it as well. And if you want to see what they look like, so these are a couple of scenarios. So these are two drops hitting one another. I think it was at an angle of 60 degrees, depending on how you define it. And you see the splash sheet forming. Initially, it looks quite axisymmetric in the right projection, if you will. But after a while, once the early times are beyond us or too overstretched, then you see a bit of a differentiation and atomization, all sorts of other things that are beyond what the code was set up to do. And we can play the same game, This one's a static drop in 3D, and this is a drop again impacting it at an angle. And I think, yeah, many of these assumptions will prove more fragile depending on how the problem is geometrically set up. But I think it's going to be interesting to explore. And actually, at first glance, it seems that, I'll show you quantitative results, I think, in a second. It seems that the predictions still work okay. Did you have a question, Sasha?
Yeah, is it right that if the tangential velocity is much higher than normal?
Yeah, that is correct, yeah. Yeah, that's the scenario where basically that U gets brought in at a kind of an order up in the approximation and starts appearing in the formulation if it's a near grazing angle. Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you. And yeah, these were the type of similar comparisons. We were looking at the coordinates of the jet route again. Symbols are the DNS and lines are the prediction. And, to the extent that we looked at it preliminarily, it looked pretty nicely. And our hope is that, within the next few weeks, especially over the summer, we get to finalize some of these things. So lots to do here. I kind of like to finish these usually with a list of challenges anyway. But the point here is, this is a tough problem. It's a tough problem because the calculation is difficult and there's lots happening, and kind of what you throw away and what you keep is quite mission critical. There's lots happening in a small amount of space in a fast time, and because the point of interest is also changing, getting the data to roll with it is also non-trivial. Actually, if anything, the difficult part in the 3D problem is not running the code. It's designing the data stream in an automated way to be able to process all of these scenarios efficiently. Because, for example, identifying where the jet route is across your 3D geometry is non-trivial because you only have point cloud coordinates of the interfaces. So actually deciding, where things merge or don't merge becomes a bit of a complication. But yeah, just to alert you that if you want to play this game sort of to its full extent, I think doing the code setup is one difficulty. Running the code takes a bit of time, but doing a clever pre- and post-processing of your data is also part of the challenge if you have lots of data to play with. This, I think, is going to be a bit of a theme for later in the afternoon because I'll tell you a bit about shell scripting and how to interact with Basilisk as well. Sweet. That was the first third of my talk, which you'll be happy to hear was also by far the longest one. But I just wanted to tell you about a few other mechanisms in which computations can interact with analysis. So this was a bit classical in the sense that, you do your model derivation. It can be a beautiful model and a very interesting one, but you kind of do it somewhere in a room. Then you have someone do the computation somewhere in a room. You meet up over coffee. You know, draw conclusions from these things, and you both improve things and move on. But they don't really kind of interact beyond that. They're still two different things done sort of not as separate streams in itself, because we do talk to one another and try to exchange information, but it's done offline, if you will. This, the missing piece of the puzzle, has a couple of problems that I thought were interesting, because what is happening now is designing the approximation with the model. You can almost get it there, but you're usually missing one final approximation, one final law, one final element that would close the problem. And instead of running a full monolithical solve of the full problem, we can be a bit subtle and basically focus on that missing piece and extract the information from it that would give model closure. So the next two problems are kind of themed in this way. And I'll start with this one on the free streamline flow. So I mentioned we were kind of unhappy with that angle situation. So what we decided to do with Maddie is essentially look at other free surface type flows that are initially easier, and then do the inner region problem, but basically include a boundary layer, so include the effect of viscosity inside of the problem, kind of close to the free surfaces themselves. And if you do this and go through the motions again over a few pages and tens of pages, what you end up with is a beautiful little integral differential equation. So I'm sure you've seen PDEs, maybe for James you've seen SDEs of various types. Now we get an integral differential one, and this one is actually quite nice to solve, and it's it got interesting results as well. So it turns out that if you do this, you get a correction that is of the order of 1 over the Reynolds number. If you see this as a numerical person, you should get scared, because a correction of 1 over Reynolds number in a problem that should work when Reynolds number is high means that in order to make sure that it checks out numerically, you need to take very, very kind of difficult parameter regimes to go with it. So to get an actual check of this, we had to take our problems to really high Reynolds number and inspect small deviations. So this was a bit tough to do, and you'll see that even initial condition setups and so on require a bit of finesse that we still need to work on in some sense, but it got us there. And it turns out that, yeah, you get insight onto how this shape, this is the actual free surface shape, is changed if you include viscosity, and you get a sense of the shift. And if you work hard, then you can also notice that the free surface, like basically introducing surface tension gives you no qualitative differences. What I'm doing here is basically bringing back all of the effects that we've ignored before to try to see what's the culprit behind the jet angle situation. And we did find a correction to this that took us, I think, about halfway through all of these mechanisms. Kind of the punchline here is this is the inner region type of problem we were looking at before, cast in the right way. And we play the same game. We find this shape correction, which will give us the angle correction, and it seems to check out numerically. And the way I've done this here is, I'm not going to use the board, but you can imagine it. If you remember the sketch with the outer region, the inner region, and the jet region, I've only simulated the inner region. So I've really taken basically this picture in the numerics and inherited boundary conditions on all sides, well, on 2 of the sides from the theory, left an outflow boundary here. I still had to deal with the gas, with a few other conditions that only exist in the DNS, but it's otherwise as kind of embedded into the asymptotics framework as possible. So this is my slide moaning about how difficult this is, but I think I conveyed that well enough. The domain size has to be quite large as well, but if you play this game ultimately, you actually get pretty good agreement. And if you take slightly gentler deviations geometrically from where you want to be, it all checks out nicely. So we were quite happy. This was a nice opportunity to sort of bring back a few generations of Wagner theory specialists into the mix, and it was a nice problem to work on. The year 2020 provided time for reflection, if you will, on problems to work on. And the other problem that we started back then and finished a bit later, which I found really cool. So this was with John and Hilary Ockenden, with Tom Mullen, who many of us know, and with Mo Dalvadi at the helm. This is the problem of the levitating cylinder. So this is a bit different from before. Now we don't have a drop, we have a solid cylinder. I'll show you a couple of movies. So what it does is, I'll kind of give you the setup first. You have a pool of oil that has a conveyor belt going out and in, there's a little wheel here. and you stick a cylinder to it, and you find that if you let it run long enough, you can get that cylinder to levitate, to sit in place. It's basically, it sticks to it because of the oil, and after some initial adjustments, it does stay put. So I'll show you what it looks like. This is a front view. It has an X on it so that you see how it's spinning, but this is, taken with a camera in the lab. You see some small wiggles, but it's roughly staying in place. And as a side view, it's something like this. So it's quite cool. So yeah, we were kind of wondering what exactly the mechanism is. This is of course relevant to quite a few processes that have to do with manufacturing, car parts and things like that. But it was a nice problem in itself, and I know John and Hillary put out a paper recently on the cube version of this, I think, or another kind of more rectangular type of geometry that has again some experiments attached to it we've been chatting about. But yeah, so think for a second, how would you model this? The temptation, if you have a DNS type of tool, is to basically jump in, put a boundary condition that mimics the movement of this, prescribe the position of the solid initially, and then cover it up with the oil and let everything run. It's quite tough to do, especially in the context of the oil being quite viscous and in general the sizing, the geometry being quite large. So instead, because Mo had done some really nice work ahead of this problem, he knew the exact structure involved, which brings me to the activity I wanted to bring you before. So we've had some matched asymptotics problems, starting from the classics like boundary layers. I showed you the splashing Wagner theory one where we had 3 regions. In this problem with the cylinder, how many regions do you think we have to match asymptotically if you have a think about it? So I'll turn it on online while we do that. I gave you a few options. Enjoy. Cool. I like the 3 as a theme. Yes, sorry. I thought people would just have it saved in a browser by now. Strong vote for 6 so far. A very discerning eye. Anyone care to wager what the 6 are, if we have 6 as the favorite? Maybe anyone who doesn't know the problem, because I know some of you do. So don't cheat. But I'll show you anyway. I think I might leave this on. There's no harm in it. But it was on the next slide. Basically, this is the structure. I don't know what I have here. Yeah, I'll tell you what I have here. So there's a region just underneath the cylinder. There's a region that goes around the cylinder. There's the inflow-outflow region for the oil film. And really the 2 delicate ones tend to be the ones where the liquid goes under the cylinder and goes back up again. So it turns out that in this problem with 6 regions, if you're really good at asymptotics, and Mo is, then you can pretty much get everything sorted out in 5 regions very elegantly, and you're missing 1 law for 1 of them. And this one is the difficult region, and what you really don't know is the ratio between the amount of fluid that goes up the cylinder and that stays on that band. So that's what we knew the functional form of it, but we didn't know the coefficients and if they were robust. So again, in this one, rather than simulating this full problem, which is actually quite difficult, we decided to instead recast the problem such that we only simulate this region and inherit conditions from the asymptotic framework. And this was this sketch. So if we recast the coordinates in such a way that we have a rectangular domain, really what's interesting to us is the ratio between this height and this height. And that's pretty much what we've set up. It's a Stokes flow problem. You can formalize it a bit with some asymptotics and a bit of a torque balance, but I think this is the details all there in the paper. I probably want to stress a bit more in this case how the analytical insight feeds the numerical simulations associated with it. This is what you get. This is the full set of numerical results for an increasing capillary number in this case, and different rotation speeds of that conveyor belt from the DNS. So each of these symbols is an individual run, and if I put them in the right place, this is roughly what they look like. So I've actually looked at them from the perspective of setting them in a moving frame of reference relative to the rotation of the cylinder above, and it was pretty much like an inflow feedback problem in which I wanted to keep the tip fixed, and I adjusted the inflow while keeping the omega velocity fixed until they reached an equilibrium, and that sets the ratio between the amount of fluid here, the amount of fluid here, and that's the ratio we report. So it was quite, my point is it was quite a particular setup for the problem in question. And to be honest, having, like, if I needed to do the full transient for the full DNS, this problem would have been a lost cause. So I think this is one that kind of really shows that you need both in place to inform one another. And if you then get all of this data, you can collapse it all into one picture. And it turns out that the law you need is a law that is the ratio being the velocity of the conveyor belt relative to the normalization velocity to the power of 2/3. And it's that power of 2/3 that we were missing. So it's again a problem where one piece of the puzzle done strategically was enough to sort out the full problem, and you don't have to kind of do the full monolithical solve. I think these two were kind of cautionary tale problems that there's a temptation sometimes to just run with it and do the full thing. And in some cases, not only is it impossible, it's just not needed. In this case, we got all we needed from kind of a clever interplay between them. This is my record for this type of problem. There was a really nice paper from Frank Smith and a colleague from 2017 in terms of how many matched asymptotic regions you can get. And at least to my knowledge, you know, we've seen 1, we've seen 2, we've seen 3, we've seen 6. This has 20-something, I think. I have not ventured to do any particular DNS in this setup, but I'm just telling you, there are spaces in which you can find more matched asymptotic problems to work with. And in this case, the complexity comes from the fact that there's also thermodynamics effects. It's a freezing problem. So it's a droplet, a super cool droplet hitting a freezing wall. So there's lots going on in there. But yeah, there's an interesting kind of message to be had for how you can embed DNS into asymptotics. They don't have to be disparate tools. Cool. And yeah, there are certain kind of thoughts that came to mind as we were working through these things. So one of them was, how can we make a large problem that's genuinely multi-scale work in an efficient way? Because, for example, if we deal with a splashing problem and we actually need the careful detail of the droplets, first of all, it needs a nice algorithm to do this. Yash is a good candidate for this because he has a nice atomization framework for many of these types of problems. But once you get this data, you will not be able to carry out the full DNS. I think the scenario I want you to have in mind is, think you're a pesticide company and you want to test if you spray droplets onto leaves and they get carried away by the wind 10 meters away. What happens? You're not going to run a simulation where you have to do sub-micron level of detail over a 10-meter domain. That is impossible with any algorithm, any machine you have at the moment. But it's a similar problem for aircraft icing prevention, for example. If a droplet hits the leading edge of your aircraft here, and then it splashes, and the airflow takes it further out and it re-impinges, you're not going to have a simulation covering all of this. You are barely going to be able to resolve your boundary layers properly. So in some sense, you need the type of tools that can handle these. And these types of multi-methodology methods, by the way, this was Oscar's 4th-year project. the middle layer. So the idea here was that rather than treating these droplets as full Navier-Stokes solves, you treat them as a cloud of droplets in terms of they're not deformable anymore. They're a population of droplets moving and interacting together, but otherwise they're treated as a collective PD, motion PD type of model. And it has, 7 dimensions, but it's still doable, and you can simplify it, and you can use a bit of kinetic theory, Vlasov equations if they ring a bell. Like, there's a formalism that goes with it, but you only have to solve one PD rather than multi-phase Navier-Stokes everywhere. And from there, once you lose the assumption that the density of these droplets is high enough to justify this formalism, then you can simply draw from the distributions and have a Lagrangian framework and just do particle trajectories. So if you're thinking, oh, my droplet splashed here, but I'm interested in droplets going in that direction, then you can have kind of a cone of view, if you will, in a certain direction, and just sample in a particular area. In many cases, you may not need the middle layer. I think it's nice and elegant. You can just do an Euler-Lagrange mixed method as well. But my point is, you need to span in many of these problems from micron over to meter-sized, and you may not be able to do it with a single method. So kind of the devil's in the detail, of course, and the difficulty is matching these regions carefully, but there is scope for doing these types of problems in a nice way. And similarly, for extensions to this, Michael, for his PhD, did all sorts of interesting fluid structure interaction problems, since I mentioned the leaf one. like impact onto spring-supported plates or impact onto membranes. So all of these are Wagner theory plus another PD governing, in this case, say you need a membrane equation that you may recognize if you have good enough eyesight. So yeah, the point is many of these problems lend themselves to really nice extensions. And finally, and this is going to be reasonably quick just because Susanna was kind enough to do the hard work of the problem in the morning, I treat the thin film control problem as a kind of different way of interaction as well, particularly the model predictive control setup we heard about in the morning. Because kind of, I'll give you my take on the situation. So the setup is the same that we know and love. You have a falling film down an inclined plane that in this setup would develop nonlinear saturated waves in 2D if you're there, and in 3D it may descend into spatio-temporal chaos of one type or another. We're interested in controlling these because of either, say, coating or heat or mass transfer applications. But if you want to do this, oh, and my favorite one is the Green Park one in London. It's the Canada Memorial. It has maple leaf perturbations on it, and quite often it's running quite beautifully. So if you want, basically, if you work on thin films, your travels will be really kind of affected by seeing hotels, airports, and parks that have thin films on them, and we're all tempted to take pictures with them, like you've seen in Susanna's presentation too. But yeah, everyone has their favorite. Point being, if you want to play this game and you have this type of hierarchy of models of different types of PDEs, of as I go down, the PDEs become simpler, it's nicer to solve things and prove things on them, but their accuracy and the transfer of that knowledge further up the hierarchy becomes debatable. That's one way of doing things, and it's the same type of picture that we have here. Incidentally, I can give you a bit more detail on what happens numerically in this problem. So if you do start the control and you do a typical feedback version of it, you do see an exponential decrease of the perturbation of the film towards the flat state as you want. And there's some nice results that Susanna and colleagues worked on over the years as well. The reason the offline one doesn't work, and these are the pictures where you just do the control at the model level and transfer to the DNS as is precisely because of that exponential behavior. Because any small deviation from an otherwise imposed exponentially decreasing in strength control means that you're very quickly going to lose it. So all of these little pictures with changing velocities and the phase shifts and so on were really as close adaptations offline as we could make, but ultimately a small change for an exponentially decreasing control in position will always be a lost cause. So it's no surprise that we need an actual online way of doing this, and we need data from the model as well. The model, by the way, at that level assumes that the wave speed is constant, and the points are the measurement from the DNS. They're around there, but they're definitely not constant, and as soon as the control loses it, you see that the points jump all over the place. So here you see on the left-hand side the feedback in blue, and the offline control on the red, again, the one that goes back, and this is the reason. Basically, the control coming in offline mode changes the speed of the wave, in that it kind of induces a different dynamics that deviates from the imposed control enough that at some point you lose it. But it's fairly systematic. Point is, it doesn't work. So that's why we needed the other one. My version of explaining delays is through Space Invaders, because I like retro references. With many of these, you can actually get good benefits from imposing the delays and so on. For those of you who like Futurama, you'll remember the episode of the Earth invasion. For those of you who don't know Futurama is, please watch Futurama. It's a good 20s pop culture reference. And yeah, then once you kind of know where you lie with these, you've kind of studied control strength versus delay and so on, you know where you are and what to do, and Susanna explained everything very nicely in the morning, so I won't belabor the point. The point I do want to make, however, is with the model predictive control with Alex. So if I kind of go back to my master curve now, and I have a little temporal dimension in here, the idea now is, what I'm trying to do with these is, I am moving the model forward in time, and I'm actually moving the model backward in time pretty often as well. I'm moving the DNS forward in time. I really don't want to move the DNS back and forth because it's incredibly expensive, but I would like it to feed information here, and I would like it to bring control information back every so often. They're not necessarily meant to be exact replicas of one another, these arrows, but you get the point. The idea here is that Whereas in previous cases, I've explained the structure was static in the sense that it was, a piece of the puzzle. In this case, you need to take both approaches along for the ride, and you need both of them to work strategically, kind of in one another's favor. The DNS data improves the reliability of the model and may even extend its typical range of validity, but you cannot calculate the control part on the DNS directly, so it would really become unsolvable. You need the model to make it work. And for me, this is kind of a nice way to see both of them come together. Alex made a really epic little movie that explains everything in one go, so I thought this is a nice way to end the kind of research side of this. Yeah, the point here was always we kind of knew and liked where we were at in terms of the modeling part, but the difficulty was getting the control part right. So this is, the type of cost functionals and constraints that you've seen before as well. Interestingly, and I'll stop it for a second, if we were to do this fully realistically, you'd have to take into account a few extra complexities. Like, for example, you wouldn't want a type of voltage being imposed that would be beyond the dielectric breakdown limit of your system. So Susanna was mentioning that you may want to cap, for example, the variation in the voltage because it may not be possible to switch on and off so quickly. There's also an upper limit, and there's also, in order to maintain an electrostatic approximation, you're not really supposed to switch things on and off beyond a certain, or above a certain frequency. So there's these types of functionals can be really adapted to other problems. The point is you can do it, and we were really glad that the proof of concept worked nicely. So in this case, the machinery was all explained nicely, so I won't go into the detail. I just thought it was a nice movie to end on. In both cases, by the way, we did work pretty hard to try to navigate towards states that were non-trivial, non-flat. So I haven't showed it in the other one, but I can very briefly. Even in the non-electrified case, for example, here, you can, so this is horizontal velocity, vertical velocity, and I'm letting them run until they reach their saturated wave shape, and about a minute in or so, I'm going to activate the control, and it'll do something just about now. So what I've done here is I've imposed a control that would have the shape be sinusoidal, but move at the prescribed velocity. So if for any reason I want to move fluid from one space to another, say in a microchip cooling system, across a constrained region where I need to lower its amplitude or I need it to move at a specific velocity, you can use distributed controls to do it. The one I quite like, that's kind of a similar type, is it this one? Yes. I'll just show you the bit after it begins controlling in this case. What happens here is I still have flow going under this, but I decided maybe in a particular region I want to freeze the interfacial profile. So flow is still going underneath, you still see a non-zero velocity and so on, and depending on how you tailor it, the idea is that you can be quite prescriptive about these. You've kind of hinted in question time before that it may not be desirable to start punching holes in experimental equipment once you've not done the 3D version of the model. So for me, the electric field version is actually less invasive and nicer. But the point with all of these is, theoretically you can do it. There's still lots of problems to be covered for in 3D. And, in many cases, for example, we've done perfect dielectrics or perfect dielectric, perfect conductor combinations. And we may want to do leaky dielectrics. But they're all, let's say, generalizations or departures from an existing platform. We were happy to have the proof of concept in place. So, this was the summary of that one and the cost functionals and the results Susanna showed you as well. What I want to end on with before we jump into the more practical side of things are two books that I quite liked reading at the time. One of them may have a newer edition as well. So John Hinch wrote this really nice Think Before You Compute book. If anything, it's a memo to myself at times. But it kind of talks about the benefits of making sure that the model equations you solve are the right ones, that non-dimensionalization is well considered. In general, that you don't click first and ask questions later. that the computations are well tailored to suit the needs. A good DNS simulation is not one that's detached from everything else. It's one that's created in such a way that it's as informative as possible. And yeah, Duran was pointing out before that it's hard to ignore the recent data-driven realm of this problem space. I think learning about data-driven fluid mechanics is important, not necessarily because I don't feel everyone needs to do it just because it's the, you know, the cup of tea of the moment. But I do think if even if we work on kind of complementary or related streams, knowing how to generate data, be it experimental, numerical, or theoretical, that could aid such things would really accelerate progress. I think it's worth knowing what is happening in this space, even though it may not be the favorite space in mind. So with that, there's now the jumping into the basilisk side of things. I did most of the work. I feel you should help me now a bit. And I've kind of set up a system in which I thought we can get something out of the discussion. But there's a few things that I wanted to run through with you first. So whenever you have a problem, or you know, when you're deciding for the first time whether to invest time in learning a code or doing a code, this is basically the segment of why basilisk, why unflip, why openfoam, why any of them. I don't think that honestly anyone can say hand to heart that their platform will solve every possible problem. There's pluses and minuses to everything, and that's why I was keen to point out that it's best if one learns 2 or 3 complementary platforms. The ones I know, by the way, just so that you get a quick glimpse of them, I've listed them here. So when I was in Germany, I was working in Quark Mesh, which is a finite element library, and I was doing acoustics things. You'll notice that the last version of that is 2014. So that's now gone, sadly, but there are more recent iterations of it. When I was doing my master's period of studying through things, the other one I picked up pretty quickly was Phoenix, which is still running nicely, and it's a Python automated symbolic processor, really powerful. It's not particularly well catered for splashing type, like it doesn't have the topological changes routines, but it offers a really friendly interface for dealing with many of the other problems, like, you know, a nonlinear wave problem where you don't get dripping type of system, and kind of related to it is the Firedrake one. I'm just telling you about these because, I mean, I'm happy to give you the links and list them. I probably should anyway, but just so that you know, there's a space to explore. My strategy was, Dimitrios as my supervisor at the time was kind enough to give me 3 or 4 months to learn as many as possible, and then we could figure out what's useful and what's not for a specific project. But the idea is there's benefit in kind of playing around a bit and noticing what works. Unflip is another favorite of mine. I think it actually complements Basilisk really well because they solve different types of problems. My Unflip contribution from back in the day was on Helmholtz equations and perfectly matched layers. Incidentally, they're the type of absorbing structures, Jack, that you were asking about as nice conditions on the walls that can be used for fluids problems as well. And yeah, the one I stayed with mostly at the time was Geris, which I mentioned evolved into Basilisk in more recent years. So this is the one that I've prepped for you to a certain extent for this session. And just before I jump into the materials themselves, to give you a sense of where things are on this website, the important bits that I've told you about already, they're all on the left-hand side, but some of them are a bit hidden. So I think the installation package, many of you will have explored, and it has a few clauses attached to it. If you get that going, the tutorial bit is a nice one, but I'll have to kind of warn you that the video functionality in this doesn't work particularly well on clusters. So this is one, if you have a local machine, there's other ways to display or extract data that's relevant to clusters in it. And the user forum is a nice part of the page where kind of a lot of answers and a lot of questions and answers appear, and you notice it's quite an active space. Every day or so you have things happening there. The bits that maybe are a bit less hidden, you'll find if you go to the all pages section, which you need to know how to interpret. One of my favorites is the bibliography one. So if you click on here, you get to see all the papers written with Basilisk that the users have had time to input into the system, and there's quite a few of them. So if you Control F for splashing here or for drop impact, you'll find tens of entries, and likely you'll find an interfacial flow problem that matches something you may be working on yourselves. And the other one, that might be less obvious. Well, the users meeting ones are quite nice. So this was the last users meeting in Paris, and you get to see all talks, all kind of things that were presented at the time, which is another nice resource. They complement the test cases and examples. So the test cases are all here, and again, I'll make it a bit bigger for ourselves, but you'll see many problems that you may recognize as being of interest depending on what you do. Some have interfaces, some don't have interfaces, and they're typically well designed and run nicely. So I'm only pointing this out because if you're trying to write the code, rather than writing it from scratch, it's much nicer if you follow an example that's close enough and modify it to your needs. And once you go through this a few times, then you gain the experience needed to jump in. So there's the test cases, there's the examples. Again, another set of nice resources. So what I tell most of my students, I can tell you, my strategy, and this is what I'm going to lead to for ourselves as well. Where am I? And the other one is on my research group page. I have a little section entitled the Research Group Manual, which contains a few sections of interest. But the one for us is what I call the CFD 101 section, in which I prepare a set of worksheets, the first few of which have to do with shell scripting, installing things and running your first code, typically a QET type problem or a Poiset type problem. And sheets 5 and 6 are more problem specific ones. So what I've done for us is I've set up a sheet 5 type of question as basically practice problem for the afternoon for ourselves to discuss. And I would like us to do this in groups, and I'll tell you how in a second. I've prepared a space, kind of a virtual space for it as well. But the idea is that the work stream I tend to envision for this is, first of all, one needs to know a bit of Linux. Then one needs to know a bit of shell scripting. And then, after installing and doing the tutorials, there's kind of a nice route into progressively more complicated problems. So if you actually want to go through the kind of Basilisk full learning curve, many students of mine who try to do this, I think would be able, if they dedicate maybe 2-3 days a week to this, I would say in a couple of months, they get pretty good at it. So it's not going to be done in an hour this afternoon. But my point is I wanted to kind of show you what the structure looks like and actually give you some of these problem sheets so that you see how the discussion works and you get a chance to interact with one another as well. So yeah, with that in mind, if I jump back to these, there is, the first question asked here, like, why bother with all of these? Why do I need a Basilisk, an umflib, an OpenFOAM, or whatnot? And I think the answer is the fact that you have those robust linear algebra parts, all the meshing, all the nodes, everything you need, it makes you not sort of get lost in the detail of the problem and not waste 90% of your time solving problems that have already been solved that are quite software engineering specific in many times. Like to make, for example, a good parallelizable code with adaptive mesh refinement is something that will take a really talented PhD or 2 projects or many research software engineering years. And there's many careers that have been spent trying to write code that would eventually get used by 1 or 2 people, and that's about it. And it's a bit of a shame for kind of the collective effort. So I'll not advocate for one particular code. I've always tried as part of today and in general to advocate for kind of good usage and mindful kind of approaches within a software framework. But I think using open source code and kind of making it available for the community to build on is an important message for this. The answer to the last question there, how do I know it's the best one? Easiest one in my book is once you've experimented a bit, tried out the tutorials and seen for yourselves what it can and cannot do, try to interact with the community. Many of these codes have hundreds or thousands of users. Many of us come to talk about it, like myself and Mirko tomorrow and so on. There's opportunities to go to meetings. And in many cases, if I have a coffee with the right someone, I'll find out what I need to find out that I could only see maybe in 2 months on my own. So I think talking to the people involved, I think, is the best ingredient. But it's best done after a bit of due diligence so that you know what the right questions to ask is, what the right questions are. I've given you the Basilisk infrastructure tour quickly already. What I'll do kind of when I finish this is once we split in teams, I'll anyway kind of walk around and I'll be available to answer anything if you need to. But in a nutshell, that was it on the website. Basically everything is there. It's just that some of the pages are a bit tucked away if you don't know where they are yet. A bit of time spent with it though will reveal all the secrets nicely. So yeah, let me tell you why I thought the teamwork bit is a good one for this. So I mentioned I did my undergrad somewhere in between computer science and applied maths, and there were two things that stuck with me from that time. First one is the term had 10 weeks there as well, the first term. My first 10-week term involves learning 17 programming languages. Everything from IDL for astrophysics to statistics ones to, I think the most exotic one that I found was SML-NJ, Standard Markup Language, New Jersey. If any of you have heard of Haskell, it's close enough. But the point was, so the professor in question, who I really, really liked, kind of, he has a nice philosophy about it, was, you know, everyone who's here is interested, and you're all clever kids, and any of you will be particularly good at C, Java, Python, and so on, pick your language. There was no point in doing a course that's all in C or C++ or whatever language that would favor a subset of the room just because they happen to have worked in it. So instead, in order to learn computer scientific logic and principles, we did a different language every week, just to get us to think in terms of recursive languages, functional programming, and so on. So whenever someone asks me, especially when I teach at Warwick, we have this numerical methods course, why don't we do it in, I don't know, MATLAB or Python or R, because that's our favorite language. And, you know, ultimately, I think there's versatility in knowing more languages, at least 2 or 3. And the other thing that stuck with me was the second-year software engineering course, which is how I've modeled this activity partly. So again, 10 weeks, and the way it was set up, it was quite nice. Imagine a room with 50 people, not a far departure from here. In week 1, there's a random allocation of teams of 5. You work on a task, say in Java or something, doesn't matter. It has a specific target. It comes with building some functionality and so on. And when the week is over, you put it in a repository, you completely reshuffle teams, and you completely reshuffle projects. So every week, you'll have and it's done such that you don't have the same team ever, obviously. So every week, you'll inherit a new project, and you have to work with new people as part of it. And it means that no matter how good you are, you will inherit a project stream that will be badly written or brilliantly written, and you'll work with people who will work with you or not work with you. And it's really reminiscent of how real software engineering works in companies. You'll not have control over what data comes your way. You'll work as part of big software projects. It's very rare that you have standalone own projects that don't feed into anything. And what you need to deliver needs to be used by other people who may not be able to talk to you immediately. So I think this idea of kind of coding in an agile way in this manner was quite useful in how to think about stuff. So for me, splitting into groups makes sense. And I think the logical way for us, because I know some of you here, is by show of hands, who has used or has developed in Basilisk before? Congratulations, you have become team lead. Basically, and I think so there's 3 of you by my count, unless I missed anyone. Who else has experience in development, maybe source code level and so on, in another package like onflip, OpenFOAM? Congratulations, you are the other team lead, because it doesn't need to be Basilisk specific. So anyone who raised their hands, you can sort of, at the end of this, keep them raised for 1 second. I think anyone who hasn't done this, I would try to migrate around them and maybe form groups of 4 or 5 people. I think the point is not as much to write code that compiles and runs and gives results today. The point is, and I'll show you the problems in a second, is to try to think around the problems in such a way that you would be able to do so at the end of this, should you want to do this by yourselves later on or kind of interact with the teams further. So this is, the teamwork setup bit. I think, Sasha, how long do we have until the break? Or when is the break? 30 minutes, cool. Because I think that's enough to kind of for me to go through the rest of the material and for teams to meet one another. There's a chance for coffee and then it's work time for the next session. So in my mind, we had 2 full afternoon sessions for this, so I prepared 2 target problems. I sadly went a bit far with the material, so we have 1 and a bit afternoon sessions. Well, I'll show you what I prepared. So can you please scan this thing? And the password for it, I think, but I'll double check, is UEA Summer School, sorry about my handwriting, 2024. I'll show you what's in there in a second, and I do need to double check if it's actually UEA Summer School 2024. Yep, is this password. So I'll keep it on at the end, don't worry if you didn't capture it, but that's what it is. And what you can find on there, I'll give you the mini tour first, is First of all, there's the set of installation tips. So this is what I had sent to Mark and was circulated your way in case you need a reference to it. I think the nice thing here is, once it loads, I have added a couple of new things, and I have written a bit about WSL as well as an alternative to VirtualBox. But if you need the most up-to-date reference of the instructions, they're there. The other thing that's there is a set of two problems, problem A and problem B, which I have here as well. So I'll rerun them from up here because it's easier. Problem A is one about falling films. So what I've tried to do to help out with your discussion is, first of all, preface the problem, give you a few of the relevant references I thought were interesting to read. The questions I would like you to try to answer in teams are, if I have to simulate this problem, in this case a falling liquid film with proportional control, before I can actually do the more sophisticated thing, do I have an analytical solution? What is it? What type of data do I need? How would I create the input-output stream? Essentially, what do I need from the literature so that I don't go in blindly into the problem? And in order to do this, I have kind of provided a bit of a framework. So it's a general setup. These are all kind of just helpful points to help steer the discussions in your group, really. You can take it in different directions as well. But the idea is to set it up in such a way that by the end of this, it'll be a nicely non-dimensionalized, well-designed applied mathematical problem with mesh independence checks, with an input and output stream and comparison to literature. And this one, culminates in actual points on proportional control that, for example, if you wanted to try out some of the material Susanna and Oscar presented earlier on, this would be the training kit I would provide for my students trying to do so. But I think I really thought of it as a kind of starter kit in that regard to a certain extent. And problem B is a drop impact one, where again, the same spirit, so it's a little bit of an introduction to begin with. I've already hinted at what may be interesting in the problem and provided a few nice references. By the way, the documents are quite heavily hyperlinked. Like when you download them, you'll see that you have little blue bits around them. You can actually just click on these papers, like you don't have to, like it's a fairly self-contained document. But the idea here is also, it gives you a few hints as to, if you wanted to simulate, not a splashing case, just a drop spreading space, problem space, then it'll give you some indication as to what nice parameters to use, what to look out for, and what to implement. And then the final bit, and then I'll give you back the QR code, I have set up for you a coding starter kit. So this is my typical framework for starting code in Basilisk, and I'll maybe make this bigger here. I'll just show you through it. Set nicer colors. Should be fine. So a typical Basilisk code looks something like this. I'll just dissect it for your own benefit. And then the idea is that you could take something like this, and rather than having, a blank page in front of you and get writer's block, at least you have a structure to work with and something to discuss around in the group. So you normally start by including the right libraries. So for example, if you do an axisymmetric problem, you'd start with the axi.h, which I commented out because you may not need it. And each of those, if you go on the Basilisk page and you type in, twophase.h, you see exactly what they do. And I kind of encourage you, as you work in teams, some of you need to go hunting. You'll need to kind of be able to know a bit about what each of these things do, or you may need to add others, but at least it's a starting point to see how the code architecture works. And then what you tend to do is provide handles for parameters in the problem. Here, I've done them in such a way that you could feed them on the terminal. So you'd compile the code, and on runtime, you'd pass parameters like the density of the liquid or the viscosity, and same for the gas and so on. So that's all of these things here. I'll show you where they come in, but you could also use defines. And for example, the domain size, I've set it to 8.0 just as a value. Everything that has fix me here are things I'd like you to think about, because they're not problem specific. They're just handles that I left for you as question marks for team discussion. But once you declare everything you need, and in this case, I've done the same for non-dimensional groups in the problem, resolution levels, and so on, then the next bit is on boundary condition setup. So I've left here just two handles to show you what it looks like. One has impermeability and no slip. So you notice the language is fairly natural. Basically what that means is u dot n is the normal component of the velocity field to that boundary. So if I have this boundary, the normal component is v. If I have this boundary, the normal component is u. And that's all that's saying is that both are Dirichlet zero. So it's no slip and impermeability. But if you wanted to do an outflow boundary, a typical condition would be a Neumann zero on the velocity field and some specification on the pressure, which includes a bit of extra detail, but the team leads may be able to explain, or if not, I'll be able to explain why it's there. Different, you can know, equally well impose free slip conditions, all sorts of other things, but this is what it looks like. And I think while I worked through it and I explain a bit, I think what I want you to get out of this is that, you know, once you get the language and go through the documentation a bit, most code, this is the driver code level, is not that scary. I think most of the language is fairly natural. I think once you get a few of the subtleties of the code in, arguably this is quite a verbose description, but it's fairly nice to engage with. Takes a bit of time, but it's eminently doable. And yeah, in the main is where the action happens. So what I do here is all of these inputs to various floats and so on, these are the arguments that are passed to the code on execution. So things like densities, viscosities, surface tension coefficient, gravitational acceleration if I have it, and I use these to compute typical dimensionless groupings. And then we have a few geometrical parameters, like setting the initial grid resolution or setting where the axis of our coordinate system is. And what I tend to do then, when I have output, rather than dumping everything into one folder, I prefer to make local subfolders, one where I save interfacial shapes, one where I save data slices, depends on the problem really, but the idea is I prefer data to be saved sequentially because quite often I may need the interface at time t equal 1, t equal 2, t equal 3 to get the dynamics of it. I'd rather just have a nice folder with interface data that I can then shell script through. So thinking of the structure in this type, to me at least, makes sense. Oh, by the way, I should preface all of this by saying this is how I do it. It's by no means the best way to do it. I think each of us will have kind of their own style of coding. It's a mechanism to just get a few handles in. I'm pretty sure once one spends maybe a month or so with it, you'll develop your own style with the code. But yeah, the rest of this, and this is all the main, it's simply assuming everything is non-dimensional. You may notice now that you have a reference fluid, which is fluid 1, and the other one has a density that's a ratio of them. It has the Reynolds number as the inverse viscosity, and the other one is the ratio. So it always assumes a dimensionless setup. Same, if it's an inertial scheme, the Weber number makes most sense, but ultimately, the non-dimensionalization just needs to be consistent. So I think that's a bit of pen and paper helps at the beginning with this. But after that, once you define a few file names and so on, the run command is here. And the only other thing you need is a bit of a flag for that Poisson projection solver that I mentioned before, just to give it a tolerance, a maximum time step, things like that. That's all it needs. So the rest of it, functions in Basilisk are called events, and they're just kind of smallish introductions to what else can happen. So for example, this is gravitational acceleration. Depending if I have a falling film problem or maybe it's an axisymmetric problem with a droplet, depending on how you want to orient your domain, if you have gravity going downwards, I would do it as, a Froude number squared, 1 over Froude number squared, but I've listed it as a fix me just so that you have a chat around what is consistent. You'd have an event that's valid just at the time t equals 0. And this is for setting initial conditions. So here's where I would, if I needed any extra refinement, so for example, if I have a drop impact problem and I know I'll put a drop somewhere, it makes sense to refine the grid locally such that the boundaries, like the interface of that drop is well represented. So in this case, in that refine, I would pick a circle or an annular region and basically say, please prepare the situation for my incoming droplet and make sure I have enough support for it. Please refine the grid there a bit more and then put the droplet there. Because if you put a circular droplet on, say, 8 squares, it'll look like an octagon. But otherwise, you don't need a full resolution, 20 diameters away. So it makes sense to refine a bit throughout and then just put an initial refinement where you need it. And then once you've done that, the fraction, and I'll let you read the documentation for it, is how you would prescribe an interfacial shape. So in this case, it's done through f. That's the code for the interfacial shape function. And for f, for example, if you put the equation of a circle there, you will get a circular droplet. Or if you're not careful, you will get a circular bubble, because you have to check where f is 1 and f is 0, and rho 1 and mu 1 get associated. It's a common error in Basilisk if you don't check carefully. It's not obvious how the initial condition is placed unless you've done it a couple of times. But other than that, if you wanted, for example, to put initial conditions on the velocity field or on the pressure field, for each command, takes you through all the cells. So then rather than writing a complicated for loop and so on, this really gives you access to everything. So if you wanted to say a uniform velocity field or a Poisson solution or something, you could just input it in terms of other things in the problem, or just polynomials or any constants or anything else you may need. Remember the discussion we had about adaptivity? This is the one line to do the adaptivity in the code. So the way to read this is, you have a wavelet-based algorithm that is really well documented. You pass along a set of pointers, set of information via pointer. And here, the only thing I'm telling it is take f, my interfacial shape, and u, my velocity field. This is in 2D, so I have two components for the velocity field. And please refine in between my min level and my max level. I typically use, say, 4 and 10 as a starting point for a problem, or 4 and 8, depending on how my machine is in terms of power. And there, you're telling it within which tolerance. So it'll try to get the best solution within an allowed tolerance, unless it crashes. And this tolerance tends to be, 10 to the minus 2, 10 to the minus 3, something like that. So it basically, what that tolerance is if it were to run the code at one resolution level and then a different resolution level, if the difference is more than that, it means that it needs the better resolution level to account for it, because otherwise it's prone to errors. So the smaller that number, the more stringent it is and the more computationally expensive it is, but that gives you a bit of flexibility. And you can put any quantities there, or you can create any quantity, like you can put vorticity as a criterion or anything else that's relevant. And you can use not only the kind of flexible in time and space adaptivity, but you can also refine certain regions. So for example, if I know, say I have a droplet traveling through a boundary layer, I may know that I want to refine close to the wall to capture the detail of my boundary layer and the no slip condition, but I also want to refine around the droplet as well. So I can impose the fixed layer of refinement in certain places, and then others I'll have them through the adapt wavelet. So it's quite versatile, and you can also unrefine. So with the bouncing droplet one I mentioned, sufficiently far away we don't need a resolution, there's an unrefine command that just says for x is greater or y is greater or r is greater than a given quantity, just make the max level there, put max level minus 2. And then you get two lower. Oh, by the way, what I mean by resolution level here is because we have square grids and so on, 2 to the level is the number of cells you have across one dimension. So a resolution level of 10, a max level of 10 means 2 to the 10, so 1024 grid nodes in a particular dimension. And everything else from here onwards is output. So to save interfacial shapes, this is the function that you can design. And in this case, you create the name and you basically give it all the output functionality and so on as well. And there's one command, output facets. It knows to give you the object f through the passing through the pointer fp1, and because you've set it up, it will basically know to save it as interface 123 and so on .dat, and to save it in the interfaces folder. So it's nice and compact, and you can do the same with other data streams. Here, because I was nice, I've shown you how to, for example, if you wanted information on the velocity field or the pressure field, but you wanted it at specific places, you can use that interpolate command in order to basically create a mask, and across a little grid going from x is -4 to -2 and y is 0 to 2 in increments of 10 to the -2 or whatever you please, you can just output them in a data file, all the values. So in, for example, my earlier kind of computational sheets when we do quet flows, for example, something like this would be useful if you wanted to measure your velocity profile. You would use something like this. Or if you have a multi-layer quet flow, you can also see where the interface is through this mechanism, but you get it saved through the other one as well. So, and the final one I have here is for running statistics. What this will give you is the iteration we're at, the time step, sorry, the dimensionless time, the time step, the number of computational cells, the wall clock time, and the CPU time. If you're running it in parallel, these will be different. And this gives you a sense of the performance. And if anything, like if you see a sudden increase in computational cells, something has gone wrong. It's okay to see a small increase, like for example, when the bouncing drop was approaching the pool, you would get grid node generation in the gas film. If you get an increase of 10%, 20%, that's okay. But if you all of a sudden see that you get an order of magnitude more nodes, it's likely something has blown up and there was a critical disaster somewhere. So the point is, having some performance metrics makes sense. So in 200 lines, this is a code skeleton that if I were to need it for a 2D problem, I would argue it would need maybe 10% modifications to make almost anything work. Because you can change any domain size, set any flow through the parameters and so on. So for me, this is a nice starting point for a conversation. As I said, it's unlikely that you'll kind of fully manage to get, proportional feedback control results within an hour. But I'd encourage you to try some of those fixed me's, or at least try to work through the problem discussions. And I think given the time, I'd pick one. Depending on whether you like falling films more or drops more, agree as a team. What do you think is best to discuss? And I think the way I thought of it is, the members of the team who are more experienced with software engineering, CFD, or coding in general can probably have a deeper look into the actual handles and the functionality of the code, but then transmit information so that everyone learns. And the ones who are more mathematically minded but are curious about interaction, you can spend a bit of time thinking about the non-dimensionalization, the computational domain setup, and the subtleties between what we've seen to be models with assumptions relative to code that is set up a bit differently and has its own particularities attached to it. So I think with that in mind, I'll jump back to the slide. Hopefully now, where's my slide? Everyone has access to it, and yeah, the password is UEA Summer School 2024, if you wanted to bring it on screen. The last thing I'll do, and then I'll just leave this on, is just thank everyone, because I've basically shown you about 10 years worth of work in maybe 2 hours from a lot of places. Yes, thank you very much for all the questions and everything else.